Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to this update on the forecast for our multi-day severe weather event that began yesterday and is continuing through today into tomorrow across the southeastern quadrant of the country. Since our last video, we've seen a little bit more clarity in the models, a little bit more agreement in the overall progression of the pertinent features. So I wanted to come back and do a forecast discussion, or at least an update on the forecast from what we talked about a couple days ago, since we have a little bit more data to work with now. So for today, we have a slight risk from the SPC level 2 out of 5 in the yellow shaded area here. So parts of northeast Texas into Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama. All hazards on the table for today. We have a tornado risk that is a 5% tornado risk from central Louisiana through that southern Mississippi-Alabama corridor, 2% surrounding that back into the eastern part of Texas. We also have a large hail threat. They did have a significant hail threat out yesterday, but some of the data has shown that that's really not as likely to materialize today, but we still could see some large hailstones, especially from parts of even southern Oklahoma into North Texas, including the DFW Metroplex, eastward through the 15% area here from East Texas into central Louisiana, southern Mississippi. So that is going to be the kind of the main threat today, especially with the in a couple of the regimes back to the west, but we could see some out to the east as well across central Louisiana into southern Mississippi. Damaging wind also going to be a threat with these storms, especially as they trek east across the slight risk area today. Then we move into tomorrow. SPC has put out a slight risk for the southeast into the eastern seaboard from eastern Alabama, the northern Florida area into Georgia and South Carolina, and just the far southern portion of North Carolina as well. All hazards once again on the table. We have a tornado risk that is at a 5% there from the Carolinas down to the south through the slight risk area. So tornado certainly a threat for tomorrow. Large hail. The threat is there for large hail, definitely going to be on the lower end, though, of the threat scale here, but damaging winds will be a little bit elevated as far as the threat for those go. So active couple of days coming up, and after that we'll see a little bit of a quiet period until our next severe weather event comes along. But for now, a couple of severe risk days to go through. So let's go through some data, and we're going to focus on today and tomorrow and how things played out, or are expected to play out, and how the models have changed since our last video. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Let's start off right away with our radar data just to show you what's going on right now, as we have a lot of convection ongoing at the moment as I'm recording this just after 9 a.m. Central Standard Time, and a lot of this convection will persist into the afternoon and may become part of our later round of our main severe weather threat with this setup. So we have a band of convection ongoing along the dry line, cold front, Pacific front, whatever you want to call it back there across the eastern half of Texas. That is expected to persist into the Louisiana region here over the next couple of hours. And we also have a lot of convection here both in the warm sector and to the north of the warm front. And if you remember in our last video, we talked about the fact that a lot of this convection during the morning hours today, it was going to dictate the northern extent of the moisture return and therefore the northern extent of the overall severe threat. And since we have a lot of convection ongoing north of the front, that warm front's going to be reinforced a little bit to the south of what was at least initially expected. If you recall from our last video, the NAM was showing a pretty northward advance of the moisture up here into perhaps even southeast Oklahoma, southern Arkansas. That is not the case anymore. If we put on our surface observations here, let me zoom in real quick just to show you where the storms are in relation to our radar. I'm going to put on the station plots here. We'll look at our surface data here a little bit more closely here in just a second. But you'll see that our surface plots, and I'll pause the loop here just so we can get a good look. So this is our most recent radar imagery and our surface station plot. So our warm front, you can see the wind shift here, more easterly winds across northern Louisiana in the northern half of Mississippi, with more southerly winds down here to the south. So our warm front is situated somewhere here along this corridor. Somewhere just roughly, we'll take a closer look at our surface observations here in just a second. But our warm front is situated right there. So we do have some convection that is in the warm sector, but a lot of convection ongoing to the north of the warm front. And that is going to prohibit the warm front from really making a far northward advance into places like southern Arkansas, northern Mississippi. So that is going to keep the northern extent of the severe threat at bay as well. So wherever the best moisture is going to be the severe threat for today, and it looks like that moisture is not going to be able to make it that far north because of the abundance of convection to the north of the warm front. So let's go ahead and take a look, and I'll mention here before we move on that some of these storms are strong. We don't have any severe warnings at this time, but that could change here going into the next several hours. A lot of this activity is elevated. The atmosphere not quite ready yet for robust surface-based convective activity, but as we go into the afternoon, as that surface boundary layer heats, that is going to change, and we could see some severe warnings pop out from these storms going into the early afternoon hours. Could see some here early this morning as well. We have seen some special weather statements here for maybe some small hail, some gusty winds out of these storms. So definitely could be a noisy morning for you folks there in East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, into Alabama. But the main round is going to come later as the atmosphere becomes more favorable for robust surface-based convective development. So let's move on to our upper air maps here. This is our 500 millibar map on the SPC mesoanalysis page. And here is our trough. Big old deep digging trough here, positively tilted trough, moving into the southern portion of the country, moving across the southern portion of the country. Strong southwesterly flow in the exit region of that trough. And that trough is finally starting to eject into the southern U.S. and eventually into the southeast. And of course, will be our main player, at least on the synoptic scale, for severe weather in this setup. Now, one thing to note is we talked about this a couple days ago, where that the models were showing that we may see a little bit of a lead shortwave here out ahead, even though this trough was very positively tilted. You see the axis there, very much positively tilted. A couple little ripples out here in the exit region of the trough, but on our model data previously, we were seeing a nice, real well-defined shortwave move across the southern Oklahoma, North Texas vicinity that was perhaps allowing a little bit better low-level response with this setup. That has since diminished, and we'll go into the models as we always do in just a second, but here is some of the model prog. At least this is the NAM model progs over the last several days, and this is our current initialization of this positively tilted trough. You see a much flatter kind of depiction of the exit region of this trough, whereas if we go back a couple days, you'll notice that we had a little bit better, a little bit more robust, more neutrally tilted solution, and perhaps even a negatively tilted solution here with this shortwave. You see the little bit of a kink here in the height contours moving across Oklahoma into Texas. This is valid at 3 p.m. today, and this is our 0Z run on the 7th, so the evening run on March 6th, so a couple days ago. This was showing a much more, not much more, but definitely a more robust solution as this trough moved off to the east, perhaps leading to a stronger low-level response. And that's why we were talking about perhaps a threat developing here across the Arklatex vicinity today for a few long-track intense supercells out in that region. That has since diminished, as you can see here as we go through with the model solutions with time. That shortwave has kind of gone away a little bit, not nearly as robust a solution there in the exit region of the trough with that shortwave. So that has led to a weaker low-level response. And so as you can see here, we can see that here on the 500 millibar map, and as we go down to the surface as well, you will see that we don't really have as tight of a surface load down there as we would normally expect with a significant severe weather event. You see just a broad surface cyclone here from the Midwest into the southern U.S. Not really that tight concentrated surface load that we were seeing on models a couple of days ago. Let me go back here. I'll take a look at the surface data, and we'll do that same thing here. So we'll compare previous runs. And this is just the morning initialization here. You see a couple days ago, we were seeing a little bit, really a much tighter surface low here across the Red River vicinity. Many more closed contours there across that Red River region. And as we go forward, this was the evening run on the 6th as well. And as you can see, as we go forward with time, the NAM has really backed off on that solution, much broader, weaker, low-level cyclone. And as a result, we've seen a weaker low-level response and an overall decrease in the severe potential with this setup, especially in that Arklatex region there. So that has been a major change since we last spoke, in that we have a much different, much less favorable orientation to the trough aloft and much weaker low-level response for severe weather with this setup. So, but once again, broad surface low here associated with this incoming trough, and that will continue to move off to the east. And as we go into tomorrow, that is going to start to change a little bit, it looks like, as the trough will eventually take on a bit better orientation, and we'll see a little bit better surface low development out here across the southeast for tomorrow's severe threat across the southeast into the Carolinas. Low-level jet here will go down to 850 millibars. See that weaker low-level cyclone. We do have a plume of low-level jet, 30 to 40 knots of flow there from the southeast into the Midwest. And one of the issues with this setup, as we talked about, was going to be that the low-level jet was going to be displaced off to the east of our main surface boundaries for the most part, at least our dry line back here across Texas. We're well removed from that plume of low-level jet, and that is not going to change much throughout the day. We will still have a nice plume of 30, 40, 45 knots maybe of low-level flow there going forward in time out here across southern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama. So storms that are able to form in the eastern portion of the risk area will be able to take advantage of a little bit stronger low-level shear for perhaps an enhanced tornado threat within that corridor. But back to the west, any storms that form here across Texas into western Louisiana going to be well displaced, well removed from that stronger low-level flow. Therefore, mainly a damaging wind and large hail threat, especially if storms can fire back here in the closer to the cold air aloft with the trough aloft. So, interesting setup for sure. Definitely one that has trended away from a significant severe weather event. A couple days ago, we were thinking maybe we could see a strong tornado or two out of this, and that still is the case given stronger low-level flow out here across the eastern portion of the risk area. But certainly the widespread nature of the severe event has declined somewhat, given a little bit less favorable depiction of the features with this setup. Here's our current surface map. This is what we have going on right now. And you can see we have 60s dew points up here into far eastern Texas, even some 70s dew points there. Pretty sharp boundary along the warm front. Actually, probably going to be a little bit farther south of there. You see northerly flow here across Oklahoma into Texas. That colder air has intruded pretty far south. And as a result of our ongoing convection, that warm front has been shunted a little bit farther to the south as well. So here is our warm front somewhere in this vicinity right here. A little bit tough to put it exactly where it needs to be. And probably even farther south than that. So probably somewhere right in here. You can see the wind shift there. So your warm front just roughly right in there. And again, that's not going to be able to traverse that far north today because of all that convection ongoing to the north of the front. That's going to do what we call reinforcing. That's going to reinforce that front to the south a little bit, and therefore the northern extent of the severe threat is going to be cut off and will not be able to transport into places like southeast Oklahoma, Arkansas, northern Mississippi, northern Alabama. It's going to stay down here to the south because of that ongoing convection. Rich moisture, though, moving inland. We have some 70s dew points here along the Louisiana and Texas coast, so much richer moisture than yesterday's event, and that is going to allow for a richer low-level boundary layer, a juicier boundary layer, if you will. Although that may have some implications on the overall instability. We'll talk about that in just a second. But overall, nice southerly flow out here across the warm sector. 70s dew points, bringing those 70s dew points inland south of the warm front, giving us a nice air mass for severe thunderstorms there across the southeast today. A couple of soundings to take a look at. Let's go ahead and go right to Lake Charles, right in our severe weather threat area. So this is going to be on the western extent of the severe weather threat area. 12Z sounding at Lake Charles, and you see we have much deeper moisture. We talked about a couple days ago. The moisture with yesterday's threat was very, very shallow. That did not extend very high up into the atmosphere at all. Much different today. We have a much deeper moist layer beneath what appears to be a little bit of a remnant elevated mixed layer there, right at 700, right at or just above 700 millibars, but very deep moisture. And even though we have deep moisture, though, that is going to, our low-level lapse rates, that instability in the low levels is going to be very, very limited. You can see here, if we just look at the overall value, 0 to 3 kilometer lapse rates at 4.9 degrees Celsius per kilometer. That is very, very limited. Usually we like to see those lapse rates above 6 degrees Celsius per kilometer. That's kind of our benchmark for what we call steeper or adequate steep lapse rates. Not so much here. 4.9 degrees Celsius per kilometer in that lowest 3 kilometers of the atmosphere, which extends right up to about there, just beneath our elevated mixed layer. So even though we have deep moisture, very limited low-level thermodynamics with this setup, and I don't think that's going to be all that likely to change. If we look at our satellite, we see quite a bit of cloud cover across the region. That's going to continue to overspread the region throughout the day, so our surface heating is going to be fairly muted, I think, especially with all this ongoing convection. So that is not going to change a whole lot. We will have continued moisture advection into the region, and we will probably warm up a little bit at least into the upper 70s, low 80s maybe. So we will have some improvement possibly with the low-level thermodynamics, but overall, even though we have deep moisture, it's going to remain fairly limited as far as low-level thermodynamics go, at least as far as lapse rates go and instability goes in the low levels. And that is going to be a hindrance, I think, two robust updrafts today in this region, especially tornadic updrafts in this region. That's why the strong tornado threat has kind of backed off a little bit. But we've seen in the southeast that doesn't often matter a whole lot. You can have very limited low-level thermodynamics and still get tornadoes and perhaps significant tornadoes out of these setups out there. So I think that will be a hindrance to overall strong tornadic and significant tornadic activity today, but doesn't mean that we won't see at least a conditional threat for a strong tornado if any discrete supercells develop. And storm mode is going to be critical with this setup as well. We'll talk about that in just a second. Our hodographs, long hodographs, strong deep layer shear for supercells, 75 knots of bulk shear, so very strong deep layer shear for supercells in this environment. We do see low level flow there at about 30 knots or so at 850 millibars, and again, that's going to decrease as we go through the day. So even though we have a little bit of curvature there in the low levels this morning, nice veering and strengthening of the winds with height, 260 meters squared per second squared effective SRH this early at Lake Charles. That again is going to diminish throughout the day as that low level jet plume shifts east a little bit. And so western portions of the risk area will be mainly a large hail and damaging wind threat, while eastern portions will see that tornado threat more so than areas west. How about a little bit farther to the east here at New Orleans? And this is not all that favorable of a thermodynamic profile. Couple of warm noses there aloft, perhaps a little bit of an elevated mix layer there. Very limited low-level thermodynamics there. You see the surface temperatures, which will warm, 67 over 65 at the surface. Pretty deep moisture up above 850 millibars. But this thermodynamic profile is just not all that favorable for robust updrafts and robust sustained updrafts. So we're going to have to do a lot of work to erode these warm noses here. We will have that trough coming in, and we will have continued warm moist advection there at the surface, and some at least muted surface heating. So we probably will see some destabilization, but I don't know how much we'll be able to really erode this stuff there. And it does seem that the trough is lagging back a little bit today, and without that lead shortwave that we were progging, the overall axis still well back in here, and so we're kind of left in that no man's land, if you will, that we just have kind of broad southwesterly flow aloft, which is often good, but given the thermodynamic profile at play today, that may not be enough to really lift and cool these warm noses here to really robustly destabilize the atmosphere. So something to watch for sure, but we should have enough instability develop by afternoon to get a severe threat with these storms. All right, let's look at some model data here. This is the 12Z NAM. Just for simplicity's sake, today we're going to look at the 12Z NAM. The models are much better, much more in alignment with the setup here at this point. So we're just going to look at the 12Z NAM. If you recall in our last video, we looked at the three different models: NAM, GFS, and Euro. For simplicity's sake here this morning, we'll look at the NAM only. So here's our 500 millibar map on the NAM. Nice initialization here, positively tilted trough, strong belt of flow in the exit region of that trough. And as we go through the day today, that trough is going to shift off to the east, and we'll just really be in this broad belt of flow ahead of the main jet streak associated with this trough. Again, very positively tilted trough. We don't really see that shortwave developing out ahead. So we're mainly just left with broad southwesterly flow out ahead of this trough. Down here, especially with eastward extent, we're just maybe a little bit more of a glancing blow from the forcing. And again, that's why I think maybe the thermodynamics may be an issue with today's setup. But we should have strong deep layer shear for supercells, and we'll have enough warm advection in the warm sector and enough forcing from this trough to initiate severe storms and continue severe storms, or strong to severe storms, into the afternoon from our morning convection. So that trough continues to shift east today. We'll go down to the surface, and we'll zoom in here this time and take a look at our surface sector. So we'll go back here. Once again, broad surface low, not really a tight surface low at all out ahead here, whereas a couple days ago we had a nice tight surface low there along the Red River. That has diminished given the weaker upper level trough depiction. That will continue through the day, not really a tight surface low at all. And that, wow, that is pretty eye-opening there. You can see the boundary, the warm front appears like it's going to be shunted, at least on this model, all the way south into southern Louisiana, far southern Mississippi, and Alabama. You see the wind shift there, easterly winds there to the north of the boundary, southerly flow to the south. That is pretty interesting. So that may mean that we're going to continue to get a lot of convection north of the front today, and that is going to push that front and reinforce that warm front way to the south, much farther south than what a lot of the models were showing a couple of days ago. We can probably see this a little bit better on the moisture. So you see here We have decent moisture farther to the north with this setup, but overall, yeah, that is pretty eye-opening there. Lots of convection probably shunting that warm front south. We do have a little bit of recovery here back to the west, a little bit of a wider warm sector back out here to the west, but down here across the eastern portions of the risk area, the NAM is really shunting that front south into southern Louisiana, far southern Mississippi, southern Alabama. So very interesting progression here with this setup. This is at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time this evening. So we may not have a lot of real estate for severe storms here, except across southern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, and Alabama. So very interesting depiction from the last couple of days. Just for giggles here, let's look at what we were seeing a couple days ago. This is going to be the 12Z run on the 6th that we looked at in our previous video. We had a lot of warm sector to work with, much more warm sector. May not have been as far east as what we're seeing today. We see a little bit more eastward progression of that warm sector with today's models, but we had a lot more real estate, a lot more northward advance of that moisture, and that's just not going to happen with this setup. You can see to now, much different depiction of the overall warm sector. So the eastern portion of the risk area where that threat for maybe a conditional threat for a strong tornado or two, that's going to be shunted well off to the south, it looks like, with this setup. I want to just take a look quickly at the RAP. We'll see if the RAP has the same thing. The RAP has a little bit better northward advance here across southern Mississippi into southern Louisiana, so that may mean a little bit more warm sector to work with. Right now, according to our surface data, that warm front is situated probably somewhere right in this vicinity here. So we'll have to see how much convection continues across this area north of the front, and if it pushes that front south throughout the day. But folks in southern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, and Alabama surely will probably still be in the warm sector going into the afternoon. That will be where our greatest tornado threat will be with this setup. So let's go ahead and take a look here. Well, let's go back to our NAM run. So back to our 12Z NAM. And so we're going to have a couple of regimes in this overall setup. We do see we have enough moisture back in here along what appears to be the cold front. It looks like some sort of cold front there back to the northwest. We do have enough moisture back here across the Arctic to maybe support a few severe storms here behind the, maybe along or just behind the cold front, kind of in a post-frontal environment almost. Then we'll have our continued convection from East Texas into Louisiana and Mississippi, and then perhaps additional development coming off the Gulf of Mexico in that warm advection regime, depending on where the warm sector sets up. That could be our main focus for severe weather today. But overall, it looks like maybe a lot of convection, a lot of convective regimes. That means a lot of storms and a lot of storm interactions, and that could mean a messy storm mode for at least, which may decrease the tornado threat with this particular setup. So let's take a look here at a couple of different regimes. We'll take one here in the Arctic, still looking at possibly a couple severe storms up there in what appears to be maybe a little bit of a post-frontal regime. You see the weird wind profile here, very wonky low-level wind profile there. Enough instability, though, behind this front with some residual moisture to perhaps support some strong to severe storms with a marginally severe hail threat. Strong deep layer shear for supercells still with the stronger flow aloft. Low-level shear not even close to anything needed for tornadic activity. So maybe a few strong to severe storms back here across the Arctic region, northeast Texas, in the residual moisture, where we could see a threat for a few storms with some large hail. Now, as we go to the east, it's going to be, again, very difficult to pinpoint where this warm sector is exactly going to set up, but we'll take one out here. We'll take one out here from East Texas as well, ahead of the dry line Pacific front, and we'll take one out here in the open warm sector. This is going to be at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. We'll take one there near the New Orleans area. So back here to the west, we do have plenty of instability. If we can get storms to fire back there along the dry line, they will be in a very unstable environment. Strong low-level instability as well in that nice low-level moisture back toward the dry line, but our wind profiles not even anywhere near favorable for tornadic activity there. So again, areas to the west, more of a hail and damaging wind threat, whereas areas to the east, that they will have more of a tornado threat. You can see here, we do have that thermodynamic issue that we were talking about, very limited low-level lapse rates despite deeper moisture. Yeah, 0 to 3 kilometer lapse rate there of 4.8 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So very limited low-level thermodynamics here, and really limited thermodynamics across the entire region. Very skinny cape. We'd like to see a little bit fatter instability here, difference between our parcel trace and the overall temperature trace in the environment. We'd like to see that a little bit on the fatter side for more robust convective updrafts. Here, very skinny instability, very limited low and mid-level thermodynamics. That is going to lead to perhaps updrafts to struggle a bit for quite a while in this environment. We're going to have to probably rely on storm interactions and storm mergers to really get anything to go. But you see we do have a much more favorable wind profile for tornadic supercells out here. Some veering and strengthening of the winds with height, stronger low-level jet out this way, 40 to 50 knots of low-level jet there. So nicely looping photographs there in the low levels. Plenty of low-level shear for tornadoes, but again, the thermodynamics may hold things back here. And we're going to need storm interactions to really allow these updrafts to become robust. And that, again, may mean that we'll see a messier storm mode. We'll take a look at some cams here in just a second. But a lot of convective regimes, the fact that we already have a ton of this convection ongoing this morning already, that makes it seem like we're going to see just a lot of storms out here, given the warm convection regime along the warm front and the incoming cold front as well. A lot of forcing mechanisms, a lot of storms. And so that means a lot of storm interactions that will perhaps help overcome this weaker thermodynamic environment, but will also maintain a much messier storm mode. So let's take a look at some cams for today real quick. And again, that threat will continue overnight probably as we go into the evening and overnight hours tomorrow morning, but we'll get into tomorrow in just a second. So here we'll take a look at some cams just real quick. We'll take a look at a few cams here. You can see this is the 12Z HRRR, a lot of convection ongoing this morning, and you can see that congeals pretty quickly into a single band or line of storms, kind of an east-west line of storms there from East Texas into central Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. I'd like to see just real quick where that is in relation to the warm front, as I think that this could be relegated all to the north of the warm front, and that would mean most of that stuff is going to be elevated. Looks like it might be right along the warm front. So our warm front, at least progged on the HRRR, is right in here. So we'll see where our storms are in relation to that, just to kind of get a sense of where these storms are located. You do see they look to be at least right on or maybe just to the north of the warm front, which means they will have a tendency perhaps to be elevated. So this main band, that might be why our warm front is being pushed to the south, as these storms are going to be north of the front, producing maybe some outflow, reinforcing that warm front farther south, and less real estate for anything to develop farther to the south. So interesting development there with this HRRR run. We do see a couple beans here in the warm sector. If we can get discrete storms, updrafts to fire in the open warm sector, that may be what we need to watch for any tornado threat. Again, discrete updrafts may struggle in this environment given the very limited thermodynamics, but if we can get a robust discrete supercell to sustain itself in the open warm sector, that could have a threat for tornadoes and damaging winds, perhaps a conditional threat for a strong tornado, but I think that is a very, very, very conditional threat, and most of the severe threat going to come from this band of storms here. We'll go to our southeast sector here real quick just to see the eastern portion of the risk, and you see that continues into the afternoon across southern Mississippi and Alabama. Tries to develop a couple storms here on the trailing end of that line, couple bands out here across southern Alabama, into the Florida panhandle. But overall, this main activity is going to be from this line here across the Gulf Coast states. So we'll take a look at a couple other cams here. HRRR, we'll go down to the ARW model just to see. Let me go back to the forecast loop here. Here's our forecast loop, a lot of convection ongoing, and you can see it quickly also develops into a band of storms out here across the southern Mississippi, southern Alabama corridor. A couple of attempts at updrafts there in the warm sector, but not really much robustness to those updrafts, and that makes sense given the limited thermodynamics at play. Here's the NSSL WRF model. Once again, very messy storm mode. That is just a vomiting of convection there across this area. We do see a couple storms back here across southern Oklahoma, northeast Texas, perhaps in that post-frontal regime. So we'll have to watch those again for maybe some isolated severe hail. But overall, not much to speak of there. Didn't notice anything on the ARW. Perhaps a couple of updrafts try to get going out there in the Arklatex. But not should be isolated. Anything back out here would have just a marginally severe hail threat. All right, let's go into tomorrow's risk. Let me back out of our models here, go back to our 500 millibar map. So we'll start off this evening, and we'll see how the trough progresses at 500 millibars, and you'll see it takes on a little bit more favorable orientation for robust severe weather. A little bit of a lead shortwave perhaps developing once again on the models going into tomorrow afternoon, early evening. A little bit of a more neutrally tilted trough here as it ejects into the southeast. stronger flow rounding the base of that trough. So plenty of forcing for storms tomorrow to keep, number one, keep those storms going through the overnight hours into tomorrow morning across the Gulf Coast states. And as the thermodynamic maybe becomes unfavorable to sustain those storms, we may see that those dissipate and welcome new convection later on in the afternoon across Georgia into the Carolinas, which could be our main round of severe storms for tomorrow. So plenty of forcing aloft with this setup. We'll go down to the surface as well, see how this surface low develops. Go back to this evening to start off with, and we'll zoom into our southeast sector. So once again, broad surface low to start off with on this evening. Then we'll go through the evening in the overnight hours tonight. You'll see that surface low tighten a little bit out here across the southeast states. Nice, much tighter surface low than what we saw with yesterday's event and today's event. Because of a little bit better orientation to the upper trough, that means a little bit stronger, more intense low-level response. So that could mean a bit better, little bit better profiles for supercells and severe storms out here across this region tomorrow. That surface low quickly moves off to the east and probably will be done with this severe threat by tomorrow evening across these areas. Back to our moisture here. So this is starting this evening once again, and you see that warm sector gets pinched into the Gulf out across Louisiana, southern Mississippi by tomorrow morning. But we have plenty of warm sector out ahead of that developing surface low by tomorrow afternoon. This is 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, so 4 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. Plenty of real estate for these storms to work with. Sharp warm front there, cold front back to the west. Plenty of warm sector here across southeast Alabama, Florida, into Georgia and South Carolina there. So plenty of warm sector to work with, plenty of real estate for storms to realize. So as these storms the overnight storms will continue into the morning, and they may start to dissipate, given a little bit of lack of juice to work with tomorrow morning. But if they dissipate, they will have plenty of real estate out ahead of them for new development out here in the afternoon. Let's take a couple soundings out here from southeast Georgia, which is, I think, where our main severe threat is going to come from. Should have pretty strong warm convection ongoing out here with a fairly broad warm sector. That could mean some discrete supercells out there in that warm advection regime to work with tomorrow afternoon. So we'll take a look here, central Georgia. Pretty favorable looking profile out here across these areas for severe weather. Much better instability than what we're going to see today. 1,500 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. Better low-level instability, although not perfect. Our low-level lapse rates are a little bit improved over today, approaching that 6 degrees Celsius per kilometer threshold. Some semblance of steeper lapse rates aloft, maybe some remnant elevated mixed layer working in there in the mid-levels. But overall, nice, a little bit fatter instability to work with as well, with a very moist low-level air mass. And this wind profile certainly favorable for tornadic supercells. Nice veering and strengthening of the winds with height. There, so nice looping photographs in the low levels with this setup tomorrow. Certainly a setup favorable for tornadic activity. As we go into the Carolinas, even more favorable photographs there. Very large looping photographs there in the low levels with decent instability to work with. So that could mean a potential strong tornado threat develops tomorrow if we can get discrete supercells to fire in the open warm sector, which I think is a pretty good probability given strong warm advection ahead of this little bit stronger surface low. So we'll have to watch and see how that plays out. But certainly a more favorable environment tomorrow than what we're seeing today across the southeast states. So something to watch for sure. That looks pretty favorable overall for tornadic activity tomorrow. That's large hail given strong low-level shear, probably not going to be a very big issue, but we could see some damaging winds as well. Let's take a look at a couple of cams here just for giggles. Again, take these with a grain of salt. But as we go into tomorrow, our ongoing batch of storms, this is this evening, ongoing batch of storms starts to dissipate into the morning hours tomorrow, and we see additional development tomorrow afternoon along the incoming cold front. Not much here on the HER. Looks like a little bit more progressive system. The front already through here, and this is only at 19Z, so this would be 2 p.m. Eastern time, which I think may be a little bit progressive. We'll see how things happen today, but we still should have enough real estate for some of these updrafts to become tornadic out here across these regions, southeast, southern Georgia into the Carolinas and northern Florida. Take a look at our WRF ARW model here, and let's see. So there's our ongoing complex this evening. That moves through. We start to get a little bit better. Those storms lift off to the north a little bit more, leaving us an unimpeded warm sector out here across the southern portions of the risk area by tomorrow morning. and we start to see a few supercells there, perhaps closer to the warm front along the Carolinas, it looks like was where this particular model is hinting at. And then perhaps some development out here down to the south. Not much, interestingly, down here along the frontal zone there across southern Georgia, northern Florida. Mostly in this model, your supercells are trading along that warm front, which would have an increased tornado threat given stronger low-level shear along that frontal boundary. So interesting solution there. So it looks like a little bit of discrepancy among the cams still. So there's ongoing overnight convection going into tomorrow. Wow, not much at all on the NSSL WRF model. So these cams are not really picking up on a lot of robust activity tomorrow. I do find that a little bit hard to believe, given that stronger surface low that's expected to develop. We should have plenty of real estate for these storms to work with. Perhaps instability not quite as strong on these models. But we'll have to watch that for sure, as the wind profile will certainly be favorable for tornadic activity, especially across the South Carolina region into the southern half of Georgia and northern Florida. That looks to be our favored corridor for severe activity tomorrow with that tornado and damaging wind threat. But some of these models are backing off a little bit on the overall degree of convection, so we'll have to watch that for sure. But the environment definitely does favor supercells with a tornado threat tomorrow. So that's going to wrap things up for this video. Once again, slight risk out for today, level 2 out of 5. East Texas into Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama. Lots of drawbacks to today. I think storm mode, there's going to be a lot of storms ongoing, continuing into the afternoon. We'll see a pretty quick transition along and just north of the warm front into a line or band of storms that should overall decrease the tornado threat number 1 because of the storm mode number 2, because as we saw on some of those cams and the overall positioning of the warm front, those storms may be just north of the front, and therefore they would not have a tornado threat. We'll have to watch here down to the south across southern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, wherever that warm front sets up, as anywhere south of that's going to be where our most favorable air mass is for tornadic supercells. If any storms can sustain themselves in that environment, could see a conditional threat for a strong tornado, but that is very, very conditional given a very limited thermodynamic profile with today's setup. Back to the west, perhaps a couple storms, strong to severe storms with marginally severe hail back here across southern Oklahoma into north Texas, northeast Texas today. But overall, just a kind of a messy setup, not really a super favorable setup for a widespread tornado event today. Then we go into tomorrow. Once again, slight risk out here from southeast Alabama, northern Florida, northeastward into Georgia and the Carolinas. I think that some of the cams were kind of back and forth on robust storms out here. We'll have to see how the overnight convection plays out, but it looks like we will have a favorable warm sector across this region for a tornado threat, perhaps a conditional strong tornado threat if we can get some discrete supercells to fire up in the open warm sector across the southern half of Georgia into Carolina, into South Carolina especially. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.